Well, turn in your Bibles with me to Psalm 127. Psalm 127. This is a psalm that is a short psalm, but it's a powerful psalm that even though it's only a few verses, it's 5 verses. In fact, it is one that is rich and at the very heart of what we would call the Song of Ascents. Psalm 127 is the second psalm in the third set of 3 psalms. In other words, there's 15 psalms altogether called the Psalms of Ascents or Songs of Ascents. And these songs, these 15 songs would have been sung as travelers and sojourners would have been heading to the Passover celebration in Jerusalem. It's the Song of Ascents, and usually the reason it's called Ascents is because Jerusalem was an elevated city. And so you would ascend, and as you were ascending up to the city, there would have been a tradition in which the travelers would have sung through all of these 15 songs. This would have been an important time that each one of these psalms have vital things that families would have rehearsed together as they would have approached Jerusalem in their act of worship. They would have rehearsed these songs. It would have been psalms that they would have been very familiar with. And in fact, what's fascinating about Psalm 127 is this is right at the center of all of the Psalms. It's all at the very heart of what these travelers would have focused on, especially as you center upon this middle psalm out of all the 15. This is the only one written by Solomon that we know of, but nevertheless, the heart of what's here and what's reflected is as these travelers would have been sojourning and coming from perhaps vast distances to Jerusalem, this would have given them an opportunity to turn to God for tranquil and trusting sleep. The comfort that comes through a recognition of who God is and what his provision to their lives truly are. What I love about this psalm, especially when you think about long road trips for us, whenever we're maybe packed in a vehicle all together and we've got kids with us, sometimes the environment can shift around to various kinds of attitudes that are reflected in the car, maybe frustration with siblings or things that might come up. So you can imagine these treks with the Israelites whenever they would have been traveling up to Jerusalem, rehearsing these psalms together. It would have been a good reminder for parents especially to think about both the toils of their labor and what they're really working for and the riches that come through what God does in establishing their very homestead. But not only that, but the blessings that their children are and are meant to be in their lives. I've selected this psalm again because it does have an incredible theme for us on Mother's Day. And it's a great reminder for us also to learn to in our parenting, in our lives, in our family, and whatever God chooses to do, to look to him and to trust him. That even what we need to do and what we need to be reminded of, and especially as we're pulled away for a season to be reminded, as these travelers would have been as they traveled to Jerusalem for the Passover feast, we need to again look to God and often pull away from the excessive labors and anxious cares that life often occupies ourselves with. And what we need to do in place of that is to stir up our godliness and faith in Yahweh himself, looking to him and praising him for the blessings we both receive and that he provides for us, and to not lose sight of his providential care for everything that he gives us. So in light of that, we need to recognize 2 things. There's 2 elements here that we need to see that Solomon has for us to learn through the psalm that he's written here, right at the heart of the Song of Ascents. The first thing that we need to recognize is, number 1, recognize dependence on the Lord. We need to recognize dependence on the Lord. If you read here with me in verse 1 and 2, this is this first part of this, a Song of Ascents of Solomon. Unless Yahweh builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. In verse 1, the theme of this whole psalm is put right in front of us at the opening of the words of Solomon here. Unless Yahweh, unless God himself takes action, we would be without hope. A house would not be built. Nothing that we have would be established if it weren't for the Lord and his providential care and provision. What Psalm 127 draws our attention to, and what we need to be reminded of, is how the Lord is essential involved in whatever his people attempt to do. We must never lose sight of the fact that God, again, is essential in whatever we plan to do. Solomon, in fact, makes no allowance here. We need to understand this from these first two verses. Solomon makes no allowance for self-reliance in anything that we do. So whether it be our jobs, our occupations, seeing the Lord provide and meet prayer requests, it is all up to his volition and his will. I mean, oftentimes we toil in labor and we don't look to the Lord. And I say this to our shame, right? Because we need to be reminded, as the weary travelers on the road to Jerusalem are pulled away from their mundane or normal sort of routines and things that they were doing, to be reminded of this central psalm as they would be singing this together, reminding their families that, again, the place of self-reliance has no place with the people of God. God alone performs as the agent of success. And I would say not only in our secular occupations or involvement outside of our homes, but in fact, especially in regard to our family, in our very households. Whatever our needs are, whatever God, again, will sustain to us comes from his power and his power alone. What he wills for us to have, what we have to possess, God grant it to those that love him. And so whenever we understand how God functions, especially within our own families, labor and our work is a matter of collaboration with God, and we should never forget that. Whatever we do, whatever we set our hands to do, whether it be simple chores that we give to our kids need to be reminded of this. The strength that they have to fulfill their responsibilities or their duties, whatever they have to accomplish, is a matter of collaborating with God. Because unless God establishes, unless he builds, unless he sustains and provides us what we need, the labor that we do is in vain. Vanity of vanity, right? That's something we need to avoid and understand, that whatever we're working toward, God must be the central part of who we're looking to provide for us. I would say if you look at 1 Corinthians 15 on this, there's an important lesson that Paul even gives to this same measure. This would have been a psalm that I'm sure Paul would have been very familiar with as he gives of his own testimony. He was a Jew of Jews. He would have performed everything ritually and traditionally speaking. And so when we understand, Paul would have been saturated with the scriptures. When he says in verse 10 of 1 Corinthians 15, listen to these words, "But by the grace of God, I am what I am." That's the testimony reflected in the first two verses of Psalm 127. By the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that was within me. You see that statement that he makes there and how important that is. It wasn't, again, even though he worked hard, it was the grace of God that was sustaining his work. It was the grace of God that was blessing and building the work and labor of his hands. Paul was not taking credit unto himself, even in the work of ministry and the things that had been assigned to him to do. He was somebody who was testifying here that it was not in vain, that the Lord was supplying grace and was building, again, the influence and ministry around the labor that Paul was conducting. And it's all by the grace of God that he had all that he had. When we see in verse 1, there was there's some debate about what it means when it says builds the house back in Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, there's different references for this house. It could be the temple or palace that Solomon built. It could be in his mind. Or it could mean raising a family. That is the household of having a family unit. Build could mean to have or obtain children, and house can refer to a family in the Old Testament, this word. So when you think about this, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, how much did he follow in the lineage of his own father? When you, in fact, think about it, and what Solomon built, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, undid much of what Solomon had produced. In fact, he not only reduced the household of Solomon himself and the greatness of what had been built, but also the glory of both the temple and palace. The place of worship was demeaned. It was cut off from the people of the northern tribes of Israel, from the tribes of Judah down below when Rehoboam took over. In fact, when Rehoboam stepped in and had divided the kingdom, there was exceeding idolatry that was carried over from Solomon. And again, it ruptures the peaceful coexistence with the neighboring powers and the kingdoms surrounding. So we do understand that unless God builds the house, unless these things are established by God and we maintain, again, faithful trust and reliance upon God, we can see the damaging effects, even from Solomon's own life, that's introduced into the wickedness of men's heart and not trusting and relying upon God and his wisdom. It's so sad to see that the house of David, that had been given great promises, and we knew the future Messiah would come through them, seemed to take a tragic turn from Solomon, who, again, we know had vast amounts of sin introduced into his household and into the country itself. The decline of stability and unity and wealth, and especially once you get to Rehoboam's brief reign, the tragic end and the vanity of vanities of men who failed to rely upon God. So truly, it is up to God and his providential care to, again, build and establish households. And it's tragic to see when men fail to recognize or remember those things. We have the tragic reminder of that through Rehoboam's own tragic demise and the splitting of the kingdom and the breaking apart of not only David's house and the corruption that came in through that end. We see, again, just the tragic flow of the history up to the points of even Christ's own life. This whole picture then, recognizing unless God is behind, unless God is blessing and building, how vain things can become, as it says there in verse 1. Again, the one who is building it, if you're not building it by trusting in the Lord, unless the Lord himself does it, it's vanity. This root, even though the word comes from a different root than the vanity of vanities in Ecclesiastes, which was also written by Solomon, the concept is closely related. Both in Ecclesiastes and here in Psalm 127, everything is in vain if the Lord is omitted from one's endeavors. So don't lose sight of that. Ecclesiastes and Psalm 127 and the message of Solomon that he wants to convey is everything is in vain. Everything will fall apart if we are not trusting in the Lord, and if the Lord himself is not being looked to and he's being left out of the one who must be the vital component of anything that we labor to do. The Lord must be the center of it all. As we read in verse 2, about the mouth is filled with laughter and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then they said, that's Psalm 126. It is vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. This idea to eat the bread of painful labors, Solomon is not slighting honest labor. He's not saying you shouldn't go out and work hard, just like we saw from Paul's own words in 1 Corinthians 15. I labored exhaustively. I worked hard. It's not about failing to work hard or just not working hard. But what he's showing is the futility of fretting and fanatical labor that loses sight of the Lord and his ultimate discretion and will that he would have for the laborer. This text addresses the workaholic and those who are fiercely self-sufficient and fail to acknowledge and give thanks to God for what they have been given and the positions that they perhaps have been granted. Don't lose sight of the fact that God is the one who has placed you there. He has given you all that you have. And so unless God has established and built you up, you would have nothing. Remember that and be humbled by that reality, and be careful of your toils and your labors to lose sight of God and the one who has given you these things. Scripture demands work to support one's family. This is a biblical mandate for us as men, and for those who would care for the family, but also for mothers, and the vital role of what God has designed for mothers to be in the building up of the house and the roles that we're all to serve. We're not, to any of us, to be an unnecessary burden to others that God has placed us with in our families. And again, the role that he's given to all of us, we shouldn't be a burden to others. And we also need to recognize that there is no place for laziness in what God is willing to do and provide. We need to work hard. We don't need to defer our responsibilities. We need to find the ways in which we can be present and to fulfill all that God is doing, but all the way through it to recognize his goodness and his care for each one of us. Because ultimately, here's what it comes down to in verse 2. The last words there refer to what God is doing whenever we see that he gives to his beloved sleep. This is a beautiful picture because, in fact, the Lord, when he instructed the prophet Nathan to name Solomon Jedediah, that is beloved of Yahweh in 2 Samuel 12. The names of Solomon bracket the first half of the psalm. In other words, when we read a Song of Ascents of Solomon, beloved of Yah, then we have the first half of the psalm, and here this provides the means of emphasizing divine care and provision for his people. The beloved of Yahweh, that both is written this psalm and those that God gives care to, we need to be recognizing that God is the one who is the sustainer and the giver of these provisions and care for his people. The ones that are beloved by Yahweh, in fact, even though we work hard and we're diligent, we're not lazy, but we're also not neglectful of the things that are most important that Yahweh has given us. We're always looking to him. When we see that what is it that Yahweh is ultimately giving to those who are faithful in his service, we see in verse 2, he gives sleep. He gives sleep. This is powerful because sleep plays on the word for vain that's used in just the previous verse. Both are 3-letter Hebrew words with identical first and third letters. The middle letter of both have a similar appearance, though there are different letters. But even the meanings are somewhat parallel. Vain has the idea of empty or nothing. In sleep, working hands are empty and the mind works on nothing. So you have these two words that are working as like a cohesion together. The idea of you laboring in your own hands and how empty your works are and how futile they are in your own labors if God is not the one giving everything that you need. What's fascinating about this is as we're being diligent to be faithful to God, if we're working hard into him and we're doing all as we can faithfully and acknowledging him as his servant, as those who are beloved by God, that when you are empty, when you are sleeping and actually doing nothing, this is when God is working and caring and doing exactly what he wills for you. I mean, even in his sleep, as it reads here, perhaps is a less direct way to say he gives to his beloved sleep. And even when his beloved are sleeping and not actually out working, God is working. God is the one who is the agent behind everything that his beloved one is given in his rest and his sleep. Through all of his labors, through all that he does, God is the one who is orchestrating all that he wills. So don't lose sight of the fact that even when you sleep, God is the one who is actually building that and establishing all that he wills. This is a powerful picture, isn't it? And it should, in fact, instill in us a great trust in our God. That as we work and as we labor, certainly there's some uncertainties that we may face in life. There are all the anxieties that I think sometimes we muster up and we begin to be busy about the work and we get anxious about things. But this psalm is here to remind us that in the midst of all of that busyness, that we need to look to the Lord and trust him, and that when we are granted sleep, even in the midst of all of our anxieties and the pressures of life, We can trust God. Even when we're sleeping and at all times, we can trust in the presence and the work of our providential God who is orchestrating all things. In the midst of this as well, we need to also look at all of our endeavors, including the ways that God has designed our family, and we need to pray for guidance for our families, that God would work everything according to his will. With everything that he builds in our house and our household, in the operations of whether it be jobs or income streams or family dynamics and provisions that are needed within your very family, we need to always look and to trust God is going to be the guide according to his will for what he wants to happen. This should be the comfort of those who are beloved by Yahweh and always take great comfort in the sleep and the comforts that come through trusting in the fact that God is the one who is the central character and agent in the provision of everything that we have. The second part of this psalm is in verses 3 to 5. In verses 3 to 5, we go from recognizing, again, the Lord establishing everything that we have. And in light of that, we also have a second part of this psalm, which is about us recognizing descendants from the Lord. The blessings that come through what God does give in the sense of children to us as parents. And so this is where some of the key themes of our Mother's Day sort of ideas are rooted as well. If you read in verse 3, behold, children are a heritage from Yahweh. The fruit of the womb, a reward. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. I love verse 3 because it draws your attention immediately after the first two verses, all about the care and establishing providence and sovereignty of God and the comfort that comes through trusting and relying upon him as the central character in everything that happens. In verse 3, we're given the powerful attention grabber, behold. The second half of the psalm, in other words, commences by calling attention to the ultimate illustration of divine care and provision, and that is in our children. This is the ultimate picture and illustration of divine care and provision. It's all about how God gives children and the picture of parents and the roles of how the strength and enablement that comes through what God has designed this amazing relationship to be. In verse 3, we see again the word children being used here. There's word plays being used by Solomon. The word banim sounds very similar to the word build, which is bonim. There's, again, in Hebrew, you would see it, but in English, it's not quite on the surface. In the first half of the psalm, in verse 1, this wordplay helps unite the poem all together by showing you these are key ideas. Both the Lord building the house and the word for children are vital parts of what the Lord does to establish households. According to one commentator, and this is powerful to look at, we need to be reminded of this, of how vital the role of children are and what God does in establishing our homes. Children are, in fact, in verse 3, our heritage. When you read there, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. And that is the fruit of the womb, a reward. This is our heritage. This is what comes from us and what we pass on, in other words, from our lives, from our experiences and things that we learn through our resounding trust in Yahweh. As we look to him for the builder of all things, we are able to then hand on to those who come after us a heritage of trust and reliance and looking to God with that very foundation that we've been instructed of in verses 1 to 2. Our children are what God is building. A house is built by the providential care of God, but he does it. The tools in which that foundation is built to even greater lengths, or at least it should be, in the heritage that he gives us through what we're able to hand on to our children who are given to us out of the fruit of the womb. That is a powerful picture here. We see also in verse 4, like arrows in the hands of a warrior are the children of one youth. This is a picture of the fact that our children are our helpers. They go where we cannot go. In fact, that's what an archer has. Again, an arrow is going to be able to reach lengths that the one who shoots it can't go. So the picture here is our children are our helpers. They go out from our bow to the world, so to speak. Verse 5, just another picture of this. Children are also our happiness. They're our heritage, our helpers, and finally, verse 5, they're our happiness. Blessed is the man, happy is the man who fills his quiver with them. See, I get frustrated when I see in our culture today how people talk about, oh, children, oh man, why would anybody want to have kids? Oh, I look at how wretched kids are. And yeah, I can see from a world's perspective, parents who don't understand or value the things that the psalm is teaching would probably have that perspective. All they would see it to be, because they don't have a trust or confidence in Yahweh, there would be a perspective that would say, yeah, I don't see the value in this. It means that I have to be pulled away from my own interest and what best serves me for the inconvenience of this thing that just cries and complains and argues and makes life seemingly miserable. Why would you want that? So yeah, from the world's perspective, I understand where they come from. But from a biblical perspective, our attitudes and hearts and mind toward children are something vastly different. When we talk about children being a heritage of Yahweh, this is a powerful picture because, of course, the world's perspective is going to despise children because they don't see it as coming from God. What this psalm actually depicts, and the words used here in verse 3, children are a heritage from the Lord. Perhaps better is translated, children are a heritage of the Lord. The Hebrew seems to imply that children are a heritage belonging to the Lord himself, and not a heritage given by the Lord. They are his means in which he is establishing his own providential power and concern and glory. That's a powerful picture, isn't it? God intends, in other words, to establish through children being born a heritage for himself. To have many children about us is better than to have much wealth about us, in other words. In God's economy, the thing of wealth, the thing of greatness of what he is building and how he's establishing and what he's doing in the world, what's more important than the vanity of riches are the eternal souls that he allows to be brought into the world through the lives of children. This is the greatest treasure. This is the most precious commodity that could be possibly given to the world. And it's of God and of his heritage, and it belongs to him. This process is something that he then cherishes because he is obviously still creating and bringing into existence life. The precious fruit of the womb and what is brought into the world belongs to God himself. It comes from him. And so obviously, if God is about this work, if he's about building up the treasures of the world and creating more lives and sustaining that and blessing families with young lives, we need to see this as something that God is doing and he is richly supplying. This is in fact better for us to have the richness of that commodity than anything else. When you see that in perspective to verse 4, and it seems almost strange, doesn't it, mom and dads, to think that our kids are like arrows. Well, I mean, in my household, sometimes it feels like they're arrows that are getting shot at you. So perhaps Solomon had a little bit more in mind about this imagery that is meant to be drawn to our attention. Certainly, having a full quiver full of arrows is something that, in a well-supplied hunt or battle array, you would want to have a lot of those things in your quiver. Now, when this imagery is given to us, it's obviously one that's talking about arrows in the hand of a warrior. As children are compared to arrows, we know that sticks are not by nature arrows. They don't grow on trees, do they? You don't just go pluck arrows that are ready to go and ready to be fired that just grow on a tree. They have to be cultivated. Arrows aren't something that just is a natural product of their states. They do not grow so, but they are made so. By nature, they are knotty and rugged, but by art, they are made smooth and handsome So children by nature are rugged and untoward, but by education are refined and reformed, made pliable to the divine will and pleasure. So do you see it here? That as children are granted to us and they're the heritage of God, they need to be nurtured and crafted into this beautiful design of what their function ought to be. This picture of an arrow being filled in a quiver, and the picture as well of children and the role that God has designed them to be in the sense of protection and defensive power are guaranteed by the sons who occupy that position. And this same picture, as we think of arrows that are being made and put into the quiver of our lives, our children are what we make them. They are represented as arrows in the hands of a mighty man, and arrows go the way we aim them. So when you think about this, a good warrior, somebody who's able to take aim and fire an arrow, has been crafted for that very purpose. Certainly, again, this is telling is the role of what we have as mothers and fathers, isn't it? You wouldn't want a bent or crooked arrow or a knotty arrow or a splintered arrow to be fired into the world. There is a role that God would have for us as we think about what we are equipped to have in the lives of our children. And the role, again, of us as master warriors being able to aim and create these arrows and to fire them out in the ways and the directions that God would have us send them. This is important because as much as arrows, again, are not crafted of themselves, this is, again, the Lord's design, and we need to look to his design and his plan to shape them in the ways that he has providentially called us and to view them to be. This is the children that God has as our heritage. Those that are meant to be sent out and built up and used for the purposes that God has designed them to be. We as the, again, warrior who are going to be utilizing these things and having the full quiver full of them need to understand what God's purposes are in having a rich and full quiver and designing these things for the purposes that God has. When we read in verse 5, truly having the full quiver full of these kids and recognizing that they are a heritage of God and shouldn't be just not cared for and certainly just shot out without any aim or purpose. There's a target to be had. There's an end that we need to be looking at, that God is ultimately designed for the heritage of children that he gives to us. In verse 5, we just see the happy condition of the ones who have been blessed with this heritage that comes of God and is of him. In verse 5, blessed is the man, this contrast to the vain pursuits of the first two verses, the vanity, the futility of building things without trusting and looking at God's provision and the fact that he is building the house and all that he has given to us. This is the vanity in contrast to the first half of the psalm here, and the fact that the man is happy, he's full, he's joyful. Even the sounds of the two words are reversed. Ashrei versus Shaveh is almost sounding like these words are backwards. The vanity of man's life versus the happiness of a man's life given through the fullness of children that God has blessed to each of our families. This is a beautiful picture because the blessed and security that comes, the blessed life and the happy life that comes through having children and the heritage of God being raised up within the household that God himself builds, that God establishes, that we're always looking to God, the strength that comes through a family that has the providential trust in God can have what verse 5 has. Blessed or happy is he who has the quiver filled, but also he doesn't have to be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. In other words, this is a picture of a reference to a city. You have to imagine the ancient Near East and the city's gate that brackets the entire Psalms. The Lord establishes this, right? The Lord builds up what's within the walls of the city, as we saw from verse 1, but also in verse 5, the family that's established by God and has been have this rich heritage given to them of those that are being shaped as arrows to the purposes of the will of God himself, can have great confidence within the walls of what God has established. Verse 5, even with enemies at the gate, this is probably the psalmist alluding here to the defense of a besieged city. The gate was very commonly the point of attack, and the taking of it rendered the conquest of a place easy. So there would have been bombardments and things that would have been attacking the city. But yet if you have a strong household of children that are strengthened and built by the providence and established there by God, the defensive capabilities of that city would be able to stand. In other words, a city is only as strong and secure as the families within its walls. As the heritage has been given by God, the Lord himself is establishing that city. It's only as strong as God himself has established and strengthened the heritage of those that are within its walls. So we see again here the picture of families and the roles in which God has providentially designed for these children to be reared and to raise up as a heritage of him. And how whenever the enemy's onslaughts and attacks come against that household, that fortified unit, that the strength of the family that God has within it to be able to withstand the dangers that come from without it. This is a beautiful picture then of the heritage of children, isn't it? That are able to stand guard and to defend the very thing that God himself is building. To tie it over into our picture into the New Testament perspectives, we do have a household of faith. We have spiritual children, even if we don't have physical children. The pictures of the fact that we are all children of God and we're brought into this household. We are strengthened in our relationships and the roles that we serve, just as parents and mothers and fathers have into the lives of their kids to see God build up this heritage that he grants to us. We have an incredible heritage that unless God builds the church, right, that we know he will build and the gates of hell won't prevail against, that we can be strengthened by the heritage of what he will do when he builds his church, when he strengthens our roles and relationships within it to be filled and have our quivers filled with a heritage that comes after us and that's been entrusted to us to care for, and to see the strength of that be able to stand against whatever the world may throw at it. Even unusual times like the COVID virus where we have to meet and have church in a digital way. All the different ways that the world may come at us and the different pressures that come to the gates of our city, so to speak. The ministry and the doors of our church, to realize that even in God's promise that he will build his church and the gates of hell won't prevail against it. But also, it's a beautiful picture of the fact of the priorities of where our families need to be centered and rooted upon both the trust of God, who is the central agent in building anything that exists. And we need to look to him to trust and to care for his provision, but at the same time, not neglecting the heritage that he gives from within the walls, within the heritage of our children, and the care of having our lives filled, enriched, and being faithful to have the quiver filled, so to speak, of the heritage of those that we need to train up and to send out as messengers of defense and capabilities to then strengthen what God himself is doing from within our own household. We can be thankful then as we think about the stewardship that God has given to us, right, as both fathers and mothers. As mothers, again, giving that caring, nurturing love and training up of the children that God has granted you as his heritage. This is his heritage for you. This is what he is wanting you in your role then to perform as a godly mother, is to give that kind of care and provision, to see those arrows crafted and formed according to his will and design, so that the defense of his very household can be established. God is using that heritage, again, in our role within it to strengthen the walls, to strengthen defense of what he's given us. This is the way that God, again, builds and establishes all that he does through his providential care. It's all about the next generation and us looking to God, building and establishing his heritage as he grants us children and spiritual children and the things that he gives us from within the blessings that we have. we need to also, as we're looking to him and as we're striving to trust in him in the midst of a hostile world, we need to pray and ask the Lord to provide us with confident faith as we live in the world in which the uncertainties abound and the dangers emerge and would thwart us and be casting out all sorts of hostile things our direction. We need to further strengthen what God himself is building and establishing, just as Paul expressed in 1 Corinthians 15. I live by the grace of God. I work and I labor for these things, right? But not in vain. Because again, the Lord is the one who's supplying the grace. The Lord is the one who is building. And we need to be faithful to continue to see him defend and build what he promises he will do. So rather than being self-reliant, we need to learn reliance on God. Without God, all labor is useless, worthless, and vain. And at the same time, God-centered families are God-blessed families, because this is what God in his heritage has given us for the purpose of children. God is the builder of the house. He's the bulwark of the city, as one commentator says. He's the booster of the worker and the blesser of the family. He is the one who will give us everything we need. We just need to focus, just as Paul would say, that we are looking to the grace of God to sustain us and everything that we have as a family together. We could say the same thing for our church, can't we? God must be the center of our focus, being faithful to what he's commanded us to do and to be as family units that make up a whole of this entire body together. We are a larger family within smaller individual families that make up the greater whole of his church of redeemed people. And each one of us, again, need to be looking at each other as, again, your mothers out there, to have the perspective of the others that make up this precious family and this precious household. The care and the provision of what God has designed by every part of this, serving to build up the very household that God himself promises he will build. This is such a beautiful design, because even in the midst of all the flows of the travelers going up to Jerusalem as they're singing the psalm, they needed to be reminded that the pilgrimage itself is not at the center, and not at the center of what God is caring for. In fact, the Lord is at the center. No matter how much we struggle through life, and no matter how hard the pains of even motherhood and parenting can be, and no matter how hard the struggle is through all the circumstances that ebb and flow, no matter what we did in the way of heroics and the times that we think we did great as a parent and the time that we think we did poorly as a parent, the times that we fended off dangers and tried to, again, do all the labors of our hands, this is not what is necessarily to be sung. Psalm 127 insists on a perspective in which our effort is at the periphery and God's work is at the center. We can be thankful for our moms, certainly. And we need to be thankful for what God has done in raising up those who fear God. But also, moms, I would just encourage us all to be reminded of this, and dads, that our work and our effort needs to be faithful unto God, but we need to recognize that the work of God himself is at the center of everything that he's doing and establishing. This is what's to be sung. This is what's to be at the heart of what we remember in every season that we walk through. Don't lose sight of the Lord himself. He is the one who will establish. It's his heritage, and we need to be faithful in what he has given. Let's pray together. Father, we're so thankful for Psalm 127. We're so thankful for, again, the picture of your providential care and the way that you, again, have given us everything that we need, even while we sleep. This is a comfort, Lord, because often we can be filled with the anxieties of work and the pressures of parenting and all the different things that come our way. But Lord, unless you are at the center of it all, it's all in vain. It's all for nothing. If we lose sight of the most important thing in the midst of all this, in the midst of all this labor. Help us to say with Paul that we don't labor in vain, but again, your grace is what is sustaining us and sufficiently providing us everything that we need. Help us to be examples for this in the lives of our kids who are watching and learning and becoming sharpened arrows for the purposes of what they're going to be sent out to do. This is all according to your master plan, Lord. So, Father, help us to be strengthened by this. Help us to find the joy and the blessings that come through the the challenges of parenting. Lord, I pray that, again, our perspective would always be this, even though I think we're prone to discouragement sometimes whenever life and these pressures of these responsibilities become hard. But Father, this is all of you. This is part of your design to sanctify us, and what you've designed even for the role of mothers to, again, to further be strengthened as well. Help us, Father, to be encouraged and filled with joy because of the ways that you've designed all these things to be. We rejoice in you, Father, because of this design. And I pray, Lord, we'll be encouraged by these things as we, again, come back to this psalm over and over again to be reminded of your care and the trust that we ought to have in you and you alone. We're thankful for the moms here today. And I pray again for our time and that we would continue to build one another up in love. Lord, we're praying for next week, Lord, just praying for an opportunity for us to actually be able to meet together. We've been longing for that opportunity to be reopened to us. So, Father, if you will, help us to find a place that we can meet in perhaps a park in the area in Holly Springs and be able to at least employ our civil authorities' demands that we maintain some element of social distancing, but still thankful that we have an opportunity to at least explore that we could be able to meet together next week. Lord, help us, again, sustain us to that time, and help us to, again, always maintain the perspective of our trust and our confidence in you. We pray this, again, for your glory, Lord, and in your name. Amen.